Thank you very much, Ken. Well, today we're following up the session now with an opportunity really to, I think, process a lot of what has been spoken. I've asked one of our professors, Dr. David Leong, to come and help moderate a discussion with pastors and professors to be able to respond to Ken's talk and be able to process this together. So let me just give you an intro to David. Dr. Leong is really the assistant professor here of missional theology in the seminary. He's also overseeing the global and urban ministry minor here in the School of Theology. He spent 7 years pastoring churches, or at least being involved in pastoral ministry in churches here in Seattle, both at Chinese Baptist Church as well as Quest Church Seattle. So if you would join me in giving a hand to David Leong, he will introduce our panelists. Thanks.
Well, I'm really not that deserving of much introduction, given that most of our time really will be taken with our panelists. So I'd like to actually invite all of our panelists to make their way up now. It's a large panel, and we have about an hour or an hour and 10 minutes and so. And so if the panelists would like to come up, I'm actually going to allow them to introduce a bit of themselves. And as they make their way up and we engage in this sort of awkward transition, I'll maybe just give you a brief sense of kind of what I hope we can do in the next hour and a half or so. So I don't know about you. I'm sure it's been a very full conference. There's maybe many things on your mind. I hope that you've engaged in substantive conversations with others. What I'm hoping to do is ambitious, I think, in this time, given the plurality of topics we've talked about, given the breadth of issues that we've discussed. My hope is to do a couple of things, and one, I'm really appreciative of Ken in this final address of trying to do the impossible, project the future for the diversity of ministries that are here. But I think he presented a lot of really great challenges for us. And so one thing I'm going to ask the panelists to do, and I've asked them to do this already, is to share a bit of a response. What would be a response to some of the things, some of the challenges that Ken issued for us, and maybe through the lens of your own ministry. And so in a moment here, we'll probably just go down the line. I'll start with Tim. And I'll maybe ask you if you could introduce a bit of yourself and your ministry context, and maybe could you give a response to some of the challenges that Ken issued as you see it pertaining to where you are in ministry now. Will that work? So,
do you want us to give the response, or would you like us to introduce ourselves first?
why don't we do it together? So why don't we do a brief introduction and then a response?
Okay, at one time. Okay. All right. I guess I'll start then. My name is Tim Tseng, and I gave the plenary on Monday nights, and I was assigned with the topic of looking backwards. So I'm glad I'm here. I actually asked Billy not to ask me to put me on the panel, but since I don't want to be relegated to the past, I think this would be a good opportunity. I'm the executive director for Isaac, and also currently English pastor at Canaan Taiwanese Christian Church in San Jose, which is one of those churches that Ken accuses of being static. So we'll talk more about that later. All right, my quick response is this. Ken and I have been in the same denomination for as far as I can remember. We've met at caucus events. We've been to conferences together. We've heard each other speak. And I love him as a brother. I know that he has an incredible and powerful witness and story to tell, and he is going to be one of the legacies of our Asian American future, if not one already. So in all my years of association with Ken, I've always been an 80% agreeer with him. So because in about almost everything he says, I am in complete agreement. The redemptive vision for a multiracial, multicultural, and even more than multi-other diversity that God's kingdom is about to usher and break into this world. So a brief response about the 20% that I have questions about has more to do with not with the vision of the redemptive community, but with the means by which we arrive at that point. The concern I have always been raising is the privileging and norming of a particular ecclesial vision that demands that we all have to be diverse within our churches. I don't know, in my church, eventually, I hope we will become more diverse, but I also think that if we're going to go that direction, we also need to be aware of this practice of norming and privileging certain kinds of church models. For instance, the danger of actually becoming borderline nativist towards immigrants can come up a lot with our younger second generation, third generation Asian Americans, because we lock the first generation into stereotypes of who they are. So we have these static models that they're always Pharisaic, they're always this legalistic, they're performance oriented, and as a result, we lose sight of the fact that the immigrant churches themselves are also in formation. They're also changing. HTC is a company in Vizio. You buy Vizio stuff at Costco, right? These are immigrant or overseas organizations, and they are not backwards. They are not static. So it's really important for me, and the reason why I chose to go back to this type of church is to let people know that they belong in the Asian American conversation as well as the multiracial, the mulatto, every conversation you can imagine. But the danger of going in this particular route with this type of framework, I would say, is that we tend to normalize or exclude them and create a stereotype of the first generation. So that's my first and my core response, and I want to give other people a chance to talk, but that would be the 20% that I disagree with is how we frame who's we and who's them. And I just want us to be aware that if we truly believe in the redemptive kingdom, then immigrant voices matter.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Eugene Cho, pastor at a church here in Seattle, Washington called Quest, and run a small nonprofit organization called One Day's Wages and Q Cafe. I'll have to confess to you that I missed a good chunk of the pastor's message this morning. I looked over his presentation online, and I think just generally speaking, I don't have any specific statistics to give you in terms of what I agree or disagree. I do have an HTC phone that I should have shown while you were making your point there, Tim. So I apologize for being slow on that. I think a couple things for me is, I think in comparison statistically, we're a small bunch in the larger landscape of this country. Statistically speaking, while it's growing, and while I think we're growing in our influence and clout, we're still a smaller community. And my fear, I think, oftentimes is when I come to these conferences or participate in these conversations is this vocalized or unvocalized sense of this monolith of what Asian Americanness might look like, which I think also includes churches. I certainly have gone through my personal formation of thinking which is better than others, kind of a thought as well. I think now that I've turned 40 this past year or last year, I'm just realizing how important it is that we have not only many churches, but also many churches that are looking very differently as well. Rather than focusing so much of my personal attention necessarily on what Quest looks like on Sundays, because just for me personally, from an ecclesiological perspective, I feel that I personally have erred by placing too much emphasis on what Quest or what church looks like on Sundays. So while that is a legitimate conversation and worth talking about and discussing, I think how we go about living our lives, how we, even as an institution, engage what it means to be a good friend, to be a good neighbor Monday through Saturday, and also how we're empowering our respective congregants to live out their faith in community, amongst friendship throughout the week is really, really important. I certainly don't want to make it seem like the church is not significant in God's plan. I wonder if our concept of church isn't as critical in God's plan as we might think. I don't know if that makes sense. But that's one of my perspectives that I'm personally wrestling with. Maybe it's the followers of God, the respective brothers and sisters, those that seek to follow after Christ, certainly they constitute the church, and they're strategically placed in all over the cities, all over our country, all over the world. And I think our church's willingness to work with them, to empower them, to enable them in some way, I think is very, very critical and important, and not just through our church's expressions of ministries and creativity. One of the things, I'll just stop right there and I'll come back to maybe a couple points later, but I'll say 21%.
Well, you refrain a couple of points. My name is Hertig, and I'm pretty multicultural. I wear multiple hats. I worship at Japanese American Church, Presbyterian, the first Altadena Presbyterian Church, and they are the one who received the returnee from their internment. I also taught Logos Evangelical Seminary, where I learned Chinese American and all different Taiwanese, Chinese diaspora. And then I'm a Korean American. I ministered mainly in Korean American immigrant churches. What generation am I? I have no clue. And I taught at Fuller. Now I'm teaching millennial generation at Azusa Pacific University, and I am Isaac Southern Cal Regional Director. And I think I'm an activist now. Having taught 3 decades at the seminary setting, I'm, by the way, older than Ken by a few months. There's some justice issue, because deculturalized seminary education attributes to the silent exodus, and culture-specific Asian American churches do not mentor seminarians. So I too, as Peter said, when I was a faculty at Fuller in the 90s, MDiv Korean American students alone were more than 90s. And many of them left ministry altogether because they don't know who they are, there's no identity formation. So how do I respond to Ken's multicultural, redemptive, eschatological vision that Revelation talks about? Stage by stage. When you don't have name, and when you don't know who you are, and come to the table set by those who have names and who's been warming up the seats, as Charlene says, for decades and centuries, you're going to be absorbed by their agenda. And I, as a woman, I'd like to quote, why even in feminist thoughts, there's a feminist, womanist, mujerista, and that's what I was hit with. Where do I belong when I'm the only woman of color, evangelical faculty in 1992? What's my name? Who named the struggles, structural power inequality, capitalistic system where the winner takes it all? Where does it say? Where is the map? And I think not having the name and prematurely coming to the table, and I'm quoting womanist, when you liberated yourself from the kitchen in the name of feminism, who was in your kitchen? It's my mother, and it's my aunt. And Latino Americans are saying, you know, that makes sense. But when I went to feminist table and womanist table, you guys did not address the undocumented migrant laborers. Okay, that all makes sense. But what about Asian American? We don't even have name and badge. And we are invisible when we don't have our name. And our realities are not even described. So I think I resonate with Yuji Ichioka, UCLA faculty. By the way, he's the one who coined the term Asian American and founded Asian American Center at UCLA. He could have easily coined the term, we're going to just have Japanese American Center at UCLA. But there is a reason for that. When the colonizer leave, the colonized, it doesn't take the colonizer to continue to colonize the minds. It's the colonized carry that thoughts, just like Israelites in the wilderness. Doesn't Egypt look better? We are sick and tired of the manna. We want some different menu. I think Asian American consciousness has not entered into. We don't even have a name. So I think I would say to you, yes, I believe in redemptive hermeneutic. And I also would add spiraling hermeneutic and hermeneutics of suspicion as a woman. But I think we first need to do first thing first. What is Asian American consciousness? Our churches operate out of a cultural, a policy making. Just up in the sky, cloud nine, Jesus, period. So we have a lot of work to do, folks, is what I'm saying. That, yes, we are moving towards that direction. However, do you know your name? Do you even have identity that Paul named in Philippians chapter 3? What tribe do you belong to? So in this context, you're going to be absorbed. You're not going to be able to dialogue. It'll be still a monologue with your different faces at the table. And I think that's what I worry about. And I'll stop here.
Thanks. Well, Ken, I'm not going to yet ask you to respond to yourself. So if we could maybe, we'll pass it on to Wayne and Gideon, then we'll give you a chance to reply.
Hello. My name is Wayne Ogimachi, and I'm the lead pastor at Lighthouse Christian Church. We are about 10 years old, kind of a church plant, and we were sponsored by a Japanese church in Seattle called Faith Bible Church. And Faith Bible, although it was primarily Japanese American, wanted to plant an Asian American church on the east side in Bellevue. So they brought me up from California. I had pastored for many years in California in Japanese American and Japanese American and Asian American churches. So I think I was kind of brought up here to lead this church plant that would be sort of more explicitly Asian American and a lot more multi-Asian than Faith Bible. And so that's been great. You know, I tell my kids that I grew up Japanese American in Los Angeles, where everybody at church was Japanese and almost everybody at school was white. And I kind of grew up Japanese American, and then when I went to college at UCLA, I became Asian American. And for the first time started to really identify not just with Japanese American culture, subculture, but Asian American. And then I asked my daughter, who's 24, my older daughter, I said to her, what about you? Do you think of yourself as Japanese American or Asian American? She said, Asian American, and I think it's always been so. That I realized that she has always grown up in Asian American churches, in our church in California and now up here. I loved what Ken said. I'm very enthused about what he says. A lot of the things that I think they're seeing at Evergreen, LA, we are seeing some of that at Lighthouse in terms of becoming, not as rapidly, but gradually, definitely more multi-Asian and pan-Asian, and gradually becoming more multi-ethnic. We love that. However, we've never said that's our aim or goal, our direction. We also have tried very hard not to call ourselves an Asian American church, and we don't label ourselves that way. Although if people ask, we do say, if you come to our church, you're going to see a congregation made up primarily of Asian Americans. But we don't want to label ourselves as Asian American church because of this very thing about redemptive movement. We want to be warm and welcoming to all, and I celebrate that we are becoming more not only multi-Asian, but multi-ethnic. However, we haven't specifically said, and that's where we're trying to go. we think that is happening, and we want to celebrate that, but we're not, I guess what I would say is we're not strategizing for that, in the sense that I feel like if I were to say we're committed to becoming a multi-ethnic church, multi-ethnic ministry, then I would staff that way. At this point, we're not. We're trying to say, well, we want to be inclusive, and yet we're also trying to do some very special things to make inroads into the unchurched, unreached Asian American communities, especially English-speaking. Our church is entirely English-speaking. So I resonate with so much of what Ken is saying, that we're trying to move in the same way, maybe not always as quickly or as intentionally, but we are finding, and I appreciate what you said too, it's not just about multi-ethnicity, but it's about all these other needs, and the poor and the handicapped, mentally ill, and we're starting to become more conscious that, yeah, the church is very diverse, even if we were all the same ethnicity, and we have to be sensitive to that and minister to that, and I think we're making some good progress there, although, again, not as fast as we'd like. But I love that, and when I come to places like this and we talk about, I didn't get to go to, the seminar yesterday about Asian American theology, but I'm always curious because I've been in Asian American ministry, almost my whole life, and I feel like I have no idea what that really means. I wish I could have gone to that seminar and learned, but I don't want to be cynical, but I come to these places and I feel like we are so diverse in, who we are and our journeys, and as well as our different churches and ministries, that it's very hard to make general statements about what is Asian American ministry, what's Asian American theology, what are Asian American churches. And I kind of feel like, each of us, in whatever setting God has placed us, has to have that missionary mentality to say, who am I, who are we, those of us that are starting a church or doing this ministry, and what is the community that God has called us to reach. And to me, one of the pertinent questions is, who has God made us, and who has God best equipped us to reach and serve? And let's try to do a really good job at reaching them. And I think if we do a good job at reaching them, we will reach those beyond that particular demographic as well. But I think that's a really good missionary question. Who are we, and who has God called us to reach and serve within this very broad community, the Puget Sound area or Seattle or Bellevue, and to focus on, well, let's do really well ministry to reach and to disciple those that God has given us the ability to reach and disciple, and trust that as we do so, God will broaden our perspective. So that's a little bit about where we're at.
Well, good morning. My name is Gideon Tseng, and I'm one of the pastors of a young church plant in Austin, Texas, called Vox Veni. We've been around since 2006, and we also help lead a community space called Space 12. And it's an honor to be on this panel. I know Eugene and I are usually the representatives for the crazy kids. When the wise elderly need a couple crazy kids on the panel, they'll invite us. But Eugene's made it clear that he's turned 40 now. So if we were to take Ken's cafe metaphor, maybe I would be medium rare. Eugene has just graduated to medium. And the rest of the panel is just perfectly cooked. So. I have a couple responses. I think, one, something I was personally challenged by and encouraged by. I think being a church planter, a lot of my life is about pioneering and innovating in progress. And hearing Ken talk about legacy and history, I think that's something that, one, I need to couple better with innovation and pioneering. In my context, my family lives in a neighborhood that's predominantly Latino and Black. My son just graduated from elementary school last week. And so they had their graduation. It was beautiful. It was fun. And then it ended. This crew rolls in, like 6 guys, like 6 feet, 250, sunglasses wearing, bald, tattooed arms, and then they set up a DJ in the cafeteria, and then the music starts thumping, and I'm like, yeah. And then 5th grade awkwardness ensues. So there was no dancing. But my son is the first Asian kid in the 50-year history of the school. And for him, he only knows pioneering. And to hear Ken talk about the legacy of Evergreen and the history of that church. You know, if you tell a story and one starts in the era of Lincoln and the other starts in the era of W, we have a lot to learn. And so that was something I was personally challenged by, and I thought that was excellent. One respectful, slight pushback that I will have is maybe the metaphor of the story. I think that the American church has used a lot of capitalistic metaphors, and when we use the metaphor of a restaurant, you're perpetuating that the church then is a provider of goods and services. And if I look across the Asian American landscape, we have a community now of, I think, almost 18 million, I think, with over 50% of that 18 million having college degrees, 20% of that having graduate degrees. So you can calculate how much money has been spent on education. Then you throw in gifting and talent. And if our metaphor is to provide services so that they can come and eat a meal that will be catered to them, I think maybe there's a place for that, but that's not enough. And maybe if I were to offer perhaps a metaphor we could use for the future, what if our metaphor became an NGO? You know, we have some work in Afghanistan. And when I was standing in the city square in Mazar Sharif, and you're standing there in this busy city square with life moving around you, chaos, raw sewage, a city and a nation torn by the decades and decades of war, when you recruit someone to be there, there's a purpose, there's a need. And I think if we not only recruited and told the story of the gospel, but brought in doctors, pharmacists, accountants, engineers, lawyers, into a nation and a world that's broken and in need, I think the only thing lacking from that is a prophetic vision, and whoever's willing to take the apostolic lead and to say, we've got talents and we've got hundreds of millions of dollars in education, and this next decade and this generation is ours. And so, yeah, that's my response.
So my point is this. Several years ago, we hired Dr. Brenda Salter-McNeil, who I understand is coming on at SPU half-time in racial reconciliation. We hired her as a racial reconciliation consultant. And at the end of the consultation, she said, so Ken, what percentage, and this is kind of addressing your thing, Eugene, what percentage of non-Asians would have to be true in the future of your church for you to feel you're making sufficient progress with reconciliation? Would it be the percentage of all the ethnic groups that aren't Asian in a 5-mile radius of your church? Would it be, Ryan, she gave us all these choices. And I said, none of the above. And she goes, well, then how are you going to measure it? I said, we're not looking at the faces, we're looking at the hearts. Okay? I said, if 100% of our church is still all some kind of Asian 20 years from now, but we have redemptive hearts, it's like that's the thing that really matters. You can have a room full, and I've experienced this, I'm sure you have, where it's diverse in faces, but it's actually not a community. Okay? So I said, the real key is, are we going to surrender our hearts and all those little, those fortresses that we don't want to open up to the redemptive message, are we going to put those on the altar? Because I think if we do, and this is where when I go back to the first generation language churches, I'll say, all right, so maybe right now you can't speak Spanish and they can't speak Mandarin. Okay? So maybe that's really impossible for you two to ever come together to do something. I said, but God also knows that you have racist thoughts about those Spanish-speaking people. And I feel like a lot of us are hiding our racism behind our language limitations, and we need to surrender that to God. We're not loving our neighbor. So that may not mean you can become one church. Probably won't happen. I said, but it starts there. I don't know where that's going to go, but I think we have all these places where, because we're so clear about our needs as whatever generation, we're not actually open to redemptive movement. Sometimes the movement will just be at the level of the heart. Okay? So I am certainly not dissing the first generation in all of this. I'm saying, I think the challenge to all of our churches is don't stay where you start, okay? Because there's supposed to be movement. I think that kind of addresses a little bit, I think, what you were saying, Eugene. I'm still trying to grasp what you said, Young. I mean, was there a particular...
I was deliberately ambiguous.
That's why I don't know what you said, yeah.
Ken and I, we are good friends, and we even team taught courses. But as I'm getting older like you, Ken, even though I'm older than you, but I look younger than you, I don't know. But
This is my real color.
this is my real color, too. I'm going to give you, I like your restaurant metaphor, so I'm going to add to your restaurant metaphor coffee bean. That I'm going to tell you Papua New Guinea story. And I think on the layer, there are many, many layers of becoming redemptive community. In order to be redemptive, I think we all need to be coffee beans because we are in Seattle. So I was joking. Coffee tastes good in Seattle. This Papua New Guinea mother and daughter, one day the daughter came home crying, and mother grabbed the daughter and took her to the kitchen. And she laid out carrots in boiling pots of water, and egg, and coffee bean. She told the daughter, "Would you please put carrots into the boiling pot and take them out?" What happens to the carrot? It's all wrinkled, right? Egg, you put it in the boiling water, turns into hard-boiled egg, right? But daughter, put coffee bean into the boiling pot. What happens? It changes the color of that boiling water. And I want you to be like that coffee bean. And I think what it feels like, redemptive community. Through my entire multicultural journey, and I married a Minnesotan man as well. So it feels like that sometimes you are in that boiling hot water. Our internalized racism, sexism, capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, where the winner takes it all. How long are we going to do bandage approach mission? How many decades would it take for us to raise systemic questions where you do not even vote and you don't even consider mobilizing our population to really vote for our interest? So when church is just apolitical, acultural, our generations are going to suffer. When Tea Party, backed by Koch brothers, billionaire brothers pumping money, it doesn't matter how many Asian Americans will be there because we are clueless. We are only talking about Jesus, period. But how do we incarnate Jesus in 21st century where America is so polarized and Asian American interests are out there? Our own Taiwanese American is not being, accepted when he's so qualified. So I think it's about time that you talked about social capital, basically. How can we maximize our social capital for promoting Asian Americans' interests? I think that's a theological question. And then when Chinese Exclusion Act and the LA is burning and all that, and we're going to just put a bandage because we don't raise structural questions and we don't participate in democracy. So to me, as we are envisioning constructing Asian American theology and pastoral theologies, we need to really analyze what's going on and what is going to happen to our third generation and fourth generation when we remain clueless and just give the poor a few cents. Where are we going to invest our resources, our money, our social capital, if we were to envision the future? Are we going to do business as usual? Are we going to continue to just to do bandage approach mission? One day wage? I'd like to ask a question about what are being legislated as we are speaking at this point. How many pastors are going to Washington, D.C.? What about lobbyists? So from the pulpit, there's a silence issues. And I think you all young people need to really raise structural questions that really victimize our welfare and our welfare for the larger community at large. But love your neighbor, love yourself before you love your neighbor. And I'm deeply concerned by what's happening today in American political landscape. I'm not talking partisan here. I'm talking about policies that's being passed, and then all this money being pumped in, and we're gonna just do business as usual.
Okay, now I think you're taking us way far afield. I agree. I do think that, like, the black pulpit has certainly been filled with those kind of systemic challenges and stuff like that. And it does seem like evangelical Asian American pulpits have actually stayed away from that stuff. And I think there's definitely consequences to that. And I think that is a challenge. I do remember, like, one of the things you did say in your more opening statement was we need to learn our name first. And I felt like I addressed that in the whole Hiroshima thing, that we have to be down with our own instruments. And I really feel like a lot of things that we do in the name of being Asian American parachurch ministries, whatever, we're just doing the Western thing as Asians, but we're not necessarily picking up our own instruments and really learning the beauty of them and then bringing it back to the whole thing. Right. And I do feel like the critique of the cafe metaphor, that's just something I throw out there. I actually like the jazz band better. It's still not an NGO. But it's the whole idea of everyone making their contribution. And yeah, I mean, I'm always stimulated by Lighthouse and what you guys are doing. And again, this is what God is doing at Evergreen is just one example of a people that are very invigorated by what God is doing and want to be a part of that. And I think if I could sum up really what I see happening as a result of that is that people across generations, across ethnic lines, as they really wake up to the kingdom of God, they want to be part of a church, even if it makes them uncomfortable, where there's that kind of movement. And I think whether you're a first generation church or a sixth generation church, that you need to be the church. I mean, when I went back to talk to the 150-year-old church and they're counting noses, like 30 people left. And they're like, who can we convince to come in here to pay the electric bill? And I said, that's the wrong question. The real question is, even if you die, are you going to go out as the church? Okay? Are you going to love these people in the neighborhood, not so that they'll join your church to pay the electric bill? Okay? Are you going to do that because that's what the church does, even though the neighborhood has changed? So I said, don't be so concerned about perpetuating yourself. Be concerned about being the church. And it may be the end of your church at some point, but hey, Christians aren't afraid of death, right? It's like churches run their course. It's like, but don't forget to be the church.
All right. Did you have a response?
Yeah, I mean,
Go ahead.
I wanted to respond a little bit to Young's comments, which I thought was really good and sharp and important for all of us. Maybe not exactly to this point. I know that yesterday, Dave, in our session, I was sharing a little bit about a paradigm shift for me about 10 years ago when I felt a distinct sense that God was broadening my perspective of parish and church. And so when people ask me now, where do you pastor? I tell them, not to sound smart alecky, but I pastor Seattle. That I look at the city of Seattle as my larger parish. That its needs, its leaders, its problems, its concerns, whether it's teachers, education, homelessness, it matters to me and it matters to my understanding of what it means to be a pastor. So I think we as pastors, particularly Asian American pastors, where if I can make one generalization, we tend to lean towards insularity. We tend to lean towards protecting our own, which is not just our own issue. It's an issue of people. It's an issue of the church. So I think we really need to broaden how we look at our role as pastors, not just exclusively for our church and our congregation, but also for our larger neighborhood and also for our larger city as well. Now, having said that, we're also citizens of this larger country, for better or for worse. It is the greatest Babylon in the world. For better or for worse. And one of the things that I've come to realize in recent years is as much as I think we do good work in the pulpit, there are powers at work that really influence the platforms and the foundations by which we try to do that work. And I say this not to sound boastful. I've been speaking at DC on numerous occasions, at the White House, going back this fall, because I've come to realize that as much as there's critical importance in preaching, that we really need to engage somehow in using fresh imagination issues of policies. And politics are important not because it's the end-all, but because they influence policies which do influence people. At the end of the day, that does influence people in very cryptic ways that sometimes we don't quite understand. So if I could sum up, and I'm probably putting words into Young's words, how I summed up her monologue was that we really need to grow in our sense of activism, not just for our own selves, but for our neighbors, which would include all of us. And I think we see that from a biblical perspective, that our neighbors transcend those that just live next to us or look like us as well. So let's love the people of our church, and let's do that well, but let's also model what it means to be people that are subversive with the gospel in our larger context and culture.
Go ahead, and then Gideon will.
Okay, sure. All right, thank you. Thank you, Ken, for the clarification, and I know you've done that before. Basically, my critique was not directly. I did hear you, so I just want to let you know. But I think it's really directed at a certain way of thinking that not just you, myself. I embody this too about treating my parents' generation and their churches a certain way. And to piggyback on what you're saying, I completely concur with you, Eugene and Young, that even Asian American, all of us, we need to be more public and engage the public. In fact, that's one of my own personal goals. But I want you to imagine, can the pastor of a Chinese-speaking Baptist church actually say that Seattle is my parish? Would that person be allowed to say that, even if he wanted to or she wanted to? All right, so and if you look at all the big conferences that mega churches, it's not the pastors who come out of strictly language or ethnic specific churches that get a platform to speak, right? Who gets to speak? Maybe that's one of the reasons why our next generation don't want to go back to the ethnic churches. Because if you go back, it's perceived to be a ghetto. Maybe that's why sociologists, like my friend Kathleen, who wrote, and seem to be favoring this multiracial, multi-ethnic model as the privileged model and then everyone else who doesn't fit in, they don't get heard. So I agree that I have the same struggles with the first generation, and in my church we wrestle with that too. But I have to take my struggles within my church and place it within that context, because if you look at the way immigrant churches are viewed by the larger American scene, and this is why I feel it's so important for all of us to recognize that they, even though we might have had problems with them personally in our own local churches, they are also part of our Asian American scene, and we need to find a language that includes them. So when I hear this stuff about challenging us to be more broad, remember who was going to advocate to get those immigrant voices really legitimately on the table? And if we were going to fight for immigration reform, I think we need to think about that, how we treat our immigrants within our own context as well. So that's my main thing.
Gideon?
Okay, I'd just like to maybe briefly respond to, I guess, the conversation about our expansive influence beyond the pulpit, which I completely agree with. But I do think that we need to be careful, because I think there's a prevailing theory in American Christendom, and it goes like this. Let's rise to the top in politics, in business, in places of influence. Let's change that, and then it'll trickle down. I think that's a great idea in theory, but that's with the understanding that both money and power are neutral. And if you look throughout church history, there's always been a conversation of let's influence the empire, let's infiltrate the empire with the gospel, and then we'll change the empire. Great idea in theory. In church history, it's never worked. And I would say maybe that idea of a bamboo ceiling, maybe it's a gift for the church. And that debate and that dialogue, that's the debate of the empire. They'll have it. That'll never go away. But for us as a church, we need to have a bigger vision, and there's a bigger world, and the empire represents a small percentage of that. And so I think we're not disagreeing, but I just think that we need to be careful.
Well, I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions from the floor. So I have maybe just one closing question before we get there. And so I'll ask maybe us to hear from each of you, but maybe if we could keep these remarks sort of brief so that we have enough time to hear from our conferees. And I guess trying to draw a few threads together, I'm going to ask you to do a big task. And part of that may involve reflection on the conference as a whole, doing some convergence, some pieces of dialogue, or it may just be building off of the conversation that you've had just now. I'm wondering, one of the questions we're wrestling with as a university housing this program in the School of Theology is this question of wondering how we will broker these relationships, how will we ask questions of influence, how will we negotiate the difference between providing resources for Asian American churches and ministries while also saying we don't want this to be a ghettoized program. And so given some of the conversations that you've already started, from your vantage point as a minister, as an academic, as a practitioner, somewhere in between, how do you see your own sphere of influence? How are you encountering others, and how are you broadening the influence of either your church, your research? Who are you encountering? How is that stretching you, and how is that influence moving out beyond maybe these categories of what we consider Asian American? Does that make sense?
I think Tseng Ra last night and Eugene, you all talked about tokenism. My fear is that now that we hired somebody who looked like Asian, check mark, we are done. At institution, academia, if you refuse to be a token Asian American, and if you refuse to be a banana, you have to pay the price. I call that as spirituality of Queen Vashti and Esther. If I perish, I perish. So it comes down to, as a junior faculty gets hired, am I going to sell my soul so that I get tenured, and then we do our Asian American stuff? And I say theology of cross will help Asian American faculty. I was a Vashti. I couldn't take it because every meeting, every task force you go in, right after LA riot, the written rule, policies, and unwritten rule, rhetoric versus reality. And I think coming from immigrant church setting and that kind of ministry setting, our Asian American junior faculty also has to make silent exodus if we choose to voice and speak the truth, and if we mean it. But if we remain like a banana, then you can stay. At what expense? I had to choose. I'm going to get along with myself. I'm not going to say I didn't see what I saw, and I'm going to say, I'm not going to just stay silent. This is a real dividing issue. That's why many junior faculty don't want to embrace Asian American knowledge, and we don't want to write about Asian American stuff until I get tenured. And still, you don't get tenured because the definition of academic means Eurocentric knowledge. The color of academic is still white. So in my 50-something, I dared to embrace generating Asian American knowledge and transmitting Asian American virtues. And I embrace Confucianism, believe it or not. And you young folks need to understand the strength of Confucianism. So, I don't know. It's really challenging. And my question at the time when I was bleeding, where is my village? And there's no village. So, as SPU is trying to launch Asian American Center, I highly recommend that you read Chicano scholars' article from UC Riverside. This segregated model doesn't work. And you get exhausted if you are trying to do all the white academic stuff and add ethnic minority stuff. I had to serve up to 3 committees because I had nobody to delegate who looked like me. It's exhausting. So I'm being realistic here as you are envisioning launching Asian American Center. Do you really mean business? Or do you want token checklist? We did it.
Well, I want to speak a little bit to what the role I feel like a seminary like SPU's could play in the Asian American Ministry Program. The way I see it, and you could tell from what I said earlier, I don't think there's necessarily some big Asian American theology that can, somebody's arrived at that can now be imposed on the seminary students and they can go and take and implement it in the church. However, I do feel like a very critical role, which I think is on you guys on your hearts, is to try to offer this diversity of models that are already out there, and hopefully the good, healthy models are in movement, like Ken suggested, but to give people a variety so that whatever their own, whatever our own church experience is, it's pretty narrow. And so I think this is one of the great things is to, conferences like this, as well as, seminary program, can hopefully enable people to hear the different voices and validate those voices. It's not like there is one Asian American church or one way to do Asian American ministry. And so I feel like, we need to learn from each other by hearing those voices. And I know you guys are trying to do that with mentoring programs as well as classes and guest speakers and conferences. I think that alone is very valuable, not because I come away from those events with a formula that I now need to apply in my own setting, but it broadens my perspective, it opens my mind, and it helps me to be maybe more creative and to think about my own situation. Ultimately, one time I was taking a class at Fuller, it was led by Jim Wallace from the Sojourners community. This is many years ago. And one of the students in the class asked Jim Wallace, "What do you think of Fuller Theological Seminary?" And you could just hear the silence in the room, like, that's a huge question. What does somebody like Jim Wallace and Sojourners come in, from all this radical discipleship perspective, what do you think of Fuller Theological Seminary? And he paused a minute, and then Jim Wallace said, well, I think the more important question is, what do the people of Pasadena think of Fuller Theological Seminary? What do the poor around the seminary, what do they think of Fuller? And are we being good news to our community? And I think that's a good question for us as a church. Are we being good news to our community? And when we look at our community, although our congregation is primarily made up of Asian American people, our community is not primarily Asian American, but we have to ask that question. What would it mean for us to be good news to the community, where we have our ministry center, or a few miles away where we have our worship service in a public middle school? And how can we be good neighbors? How do we love our neighbors? And what would it mean to be good news to serve them? Almost without regard to whatever their ethnic background is. And it'd be wonderful if they came into our church, but that can't be our primary concern. Our primary concern has to be, how do we love our community and help address some of the needs and help them to see that we're doing all of those efforts because of the love of Jesus, because he's got a hold of our lives. So I think, because, and I think primarily in terms of the Seattle area, just here alone, there's, even in this room, such a diversity of models of churches and approaches to the whole ethnic issues and multi-Asian issues. And so I feel like, it's not like we can elevate any one model as better than another model, but we can all learn from each other so that each of us can do whatever God has called us to do and do it better, more creatively.
Other respondents? It was open-ended, but it was more or less sort of as you think about the future of the Asian American church or Asian American ministry from your vantage point, what are the growing edges that you see? What are some of the challenges that you're facing? How are you expanding your influence? How are you becoming a redemptive community, a new humanity?
I don't know if I'll answer that question since it's open-ended, but there's a couple things I'd love to maybe encourage some folks here. When I, about 10 years ago or so, when we were trying to start Quest Church, and we were starting some conversations with people, from the get-go, obviously people out of care, they said, hey, you got to check out these churches, right? And so you got to check out Evergreen, and you got to check out New Song down in LA. And I know that these were all good and well-intentioned advices because we need models. And not that these models are past, but they're doing great things presently and in the future as well. I think one of the things that concern me about, again, this broad stroke description of Asian Americanness is I feel like we're good imitators. And that really concerns me. And maybe part of it is because I am wired a little bit where creativity, entrepreneurship are more prevalent probably in my thoughts. But more often than not, I think when I engage with Asian Americans broadly, I feel like we're just imitating more often like pervasive dominant culture or that which has been revealed to us to be successful. And I really want to encourage people to unleash us to deeper, more fresh imagination. Because I think we're still in the very much the unfolding stages of what it means to engage in Asian American ministry. Even though while we can still acknowledge history and great legacies, we're still kind of, I think, still in early stages. So when I go to like Asian American churches, it drives me nuts that we're just singing all of these. Again, I'm not ripping on like white songs, but
Australian
we're
songs.
singing. I mean, we should just call it Hillsong. We're kind of. But I mean, we're doing that all the time, and it's not because they're bad, it's just that we have so much resources. Think about some of the social capital that Gideon was talking about. And I think about that from the other perspective of arts. And it's pretty profound. So I would just love to give that encouragement that I think what will help the Asian American church is maybe permission for us to go outside that box, because maybe that box doesn't even exist. Everything belongs to God. And we need to kind of release ourselves to a fresh imagination while having great respect and appreciation for the legacy already written.
I really have to respond. Thank you, Eugene. Well, let me go first. I wanted also to affirm when Ken mentioned about how important it is to be down on our own instruments. And I really, really agree with you there. But I also agree with you that the silent exodus is unabated. And just a quick survey of the Bay Area churches. The number of Asian Americans who participate in non-Asian or multiracial churches in the Bay Area outnumbers the number of English-speaking Asians in our ethnic churches. Maybe except for some Koreans. I need to double check on that figure. But this is a reality. And I think the issue for me, as I link it to creativity, is are Asian Americans in the next generation, are we down on our own instruments, or are we consumers looking for the best? And we want to just hear the best sermons and the best churches that provide the best services for us. Are we willing to look at ourselves as a resource, our stories, our experiences? And I don't want to say respecting legacy. I think I want to go one further. Historical legacies and historical research and just historical memory are a resource for creativity. We are not God. We don't create things out of nothings. We have to have sources to create things. And we don't always have to go to Asia and get the exotic stuff. We can also look at our own experiences. So whether it's an immigrant church or a church like Evergreen, each of these stories, the stories that are part of these churches, are our sources for creativity. And one more thing to link to Brother Gabriel, I also don't think that fighting the powers at the top levels is the primary call. Otherwise, I'd be trying to blog for Sojourners or other things like that myself. I just don't want to do that, because I really do believe that it's at the grassroots where creativity transforms. And if we can create, and I think this is an ongoing thing, Asian Americans is being redefined every time we meet together and talk about being Asian American. And once we spend time together, we are becoming a creative force. So I really believe creativity and culture making is part of our calling.
I'm very excited too. So,
Last comment.
Yeah, last
You can
comment.
take us home here. 2 minutes. If you
how
can.
about 1
Thanks.
minute?
Okay.
Asian Americans, as I said, is intellectually undocumented. So I have 3 T. We have to transcribe our stories, and we have to translate that to many different generations and society at large. And we have to transmit that. And I think this kind of venue is a sacred venue where we can do that. And as a woman, please, church is also made up with women. Male pastors, if you don't understand women, your health of ministry and shepherding is at stake.
Thank you. All right, at this point, we're going to turn it over to you guys. So Raul has a mic, and so if you have a question, if you just want to raise your hand or stand, we have about 25 minutes or so for any question you may have about what's been presented today or things that have been brought up throughout the conference.
Which foot for what?
I'm trying to just form this question in my mind, so I apologize if it's kind of tumbling out. I guess I could address this to all of you, but specifically Timothy, you've, in a sense, made it a part of your priority to remind us to be mindful of the first generation and of our, the landed immigrant. I think one of the challenges for myself as sort of second generation is our stereotypes have a lot of evidence behind them. And one of the challenges I think we need, and this is a question, how do we, in what language do we use even to have dialogue, to have successful dialogue between our landed immigrant brothers and sisters and those of us who are now primarily English speaking, second, third, beyond? What kind of language do we use? And then also, how are there stories? Are there people interested in telling the stories of how our landed immigrants are being as progressive theologically and thoughtfully missional as we imagine us wanting to be. You know, our sense is that they're more interested in survival or interested in keeping their children in the church, or, you know, those kind of stereotypes. But we need stories, and we need representatives telling those stories. And how do we do that when everything's in English and most of the folks here are not representative of those communities?
I completely agree with your concerns about communication with the first generation. I struggle with that too. In my church, the church has accommodated to me because they don't use Taiwanese or Chinese in their conversations at the leadership level. So there is a lot that the first generation, they also are just as captive to European Christianity as we are, because if you look at their seminary curriculum, they're also learning Calvin, Luther, but nothing about Asian stuff either. So there are lots and lots of problems, and you're completely right. I think that what I would recommend for those of us who are here, who are English speakers, that let's first look at ourselves before, and then hopefully we can build bridges. Our pastors have to, I would urge us not to keep repeating the stereotypes, number one. And secondly, not necessarily try to use a unilinear model of how churches ought to be, because that's one of the assumptions that many bygone sociologists have used, is that people come to America, they assimilate, they become Americans. Well, let's don't use that framework, because that just completely dismisses the first generation. They're no longer important. So if we think that way, and we think that we're more progressive than they are, and that will come across as we communicate. So that's another thing we can do to change. And just how about just having an image of, we're all part of God's people. There's no unilinear direction. We're just all doing ministry the best we can, and just respect each other for that. I think that would help to just not impose that kind of sociological, used up sociological metaphors. Another, I think, thing we can do is also look at the social and racial scripts that we Asian Americans unconsciously follow. Perhaps we learn to not like the immigrant generation because we've been socialized not to respect them. And yes, there's pain, because in our personal relationship with our parents, that's there. I don't want to dismiss that. But when we learn, when we're influenced by the media, we're always taught that the first generation speaks with an accent, they're exotic, they're strange, they're never leaders, they're geeks, they're nerds. And then when we keep getting influenced by those type of images, then our own perceptions of the first generation are shaped by that as well. So I think we need to do a little bit of self-criticism among those of us who are English speaking. I'm not saying that our concerns are invalid, but I've been begging and pleading, if people have heard me, that when IVP publishes another Asian American resource, let's not keep using this type of dichotomy, the first generation is such and such, and we're like this. We're more alike than we think, not only with the first generation, but also with non-Asians. And so that would be a long response to you. But I would just say, first thing is to analyze ourselves and get down our own instruments, know what our instruments are. And I hope that if we don't do that, there's no need for an Asian American Center here at APU. We got to know what our instruments are. If we don't know, then what's the point?
Maybe I could briefly tack on to what Tim was saying. I can only speak from my own experience, but I mentioned this yesterday. I think whenever we talk about them or issues, we need to humanize it. So they need to be friends. So regardless if you're talking about women in ministry, it's not just issues. These need to be your friends. If you're talking about GLBT community, you need to become friends with them and humanize and put a face to it. And I think sometimes we have a tendency to do that with the first generation. And when our community was planted by an immigrant Chinese church in Austin. And the story is really amazing because we look nothing like them. They don't understand anything that we're doing. But there was that core leadership, and they loved me as a friend. There was no agenda, and I knew them and I loved them. If this church plant didn't work out, we would still be friends. And when the conversations got hard, and when there were things that we didn't understand, it was the love and the friendship that carried us through, and that was just our own experience.
This is to Ken, and the other people can chip in as well. What's the hard work that the pastor and the congregation, they have to embrace to really fully be, multi-ethnic? Just because, it seems very sexy to be like, oh, we want to be multi-ethnic, we don't want to be whatever, But I think people don't understand the amount of work and the cost that's involved. I mean, for the pastor, how much of what's the challenges involved? I mean, if people aren't really willing to embrace interracial marriages, can they really be multi-ethnic? I mean, that's the kind of
Right,
thing.
sure.
People don't think about that,
Right.
but then they say, oh, we want to be multi-ethnic because that's what heaven's like. Just even understanding different culture, just how much work does it really involve. So I would love to kind of hear some of that stuff, just that, how do you fail in being a bad multi-ethnic church? Because it sounds great, but then, the amount of cost and work that's involved.
Okay, I guess simply put, you have to get not so embarrassed about stepping in the pile. It's on your shoe. Deal with it, right? So when it was predominantly just Chinese and Japanese, we could, from the pulpit, I could say, oh, so, we all get this. We're all from shame-based families and blah, blah. And then some non-Asians start showing up and they go, why'd you have to say that was Chinese? My family's like that, right? It's like, oh, that's true, right? And so part of it is a recalibration of even how I say stuff. And sometimes I just go, okay, if you can't identify with this, okay, sorry, but this is just me, or this is my family, and I don't put any cultural, ethnic thing on there, and, it takes work, right? Or, I got absorbed into a Japanese American church, and so I know more Japanese than Chinese, and so I say Gohan, and, all this kind of stuff, but even though that became part of my regular pattern, it's like I started looking at the room, Japanese are a minority in our church, right? So then part of it is even, okay, so how do we still affirm the history and yet at the same time embrace the new things? So like we celebrate Martin Luther King's birthday. Okay, we have like 10 black people in our church. Okay, we have a film festival on the whole, and we all say something in the service, but then, we've heard from the African Americans and they'll go, wow, that's really cool. Because if I was in a black church today, I know we'd be talking about Martin, right? And I said, yeah, I'm embarrassed that we benefited from Martin Luther King. And so he was an American Baptist, and we don't talk about him. And I said, but in fairness to us, I said, if he was Martin Luther Fong, you probably wouldn't be talking about him. Okay, so I said, but that's the problem. Right? It's like we're all kind of looking for our own, and it's just like, no, right? So there's that. But again, we're not setting out to be a multi-ethnic church. We're trying to be a redemptive people, and then we're discovering things. So then I started looking around my staff, and I hired a guy from the neighborhood who's never gone to seminary. He's one of the most brilliant people on my staff. He's been in prison a couple of times. He's Mexican-American. He left our church 4 times in 10 years because even though he liked my teaching, no one was ever reaching out to him. He was a FedEx driver and a bouncer at nightclubs, right? And he's like this big guy. And so people were like freaked out about him, but he has this amazing heart for God. Until one day we started seeing finally the neighborhood youth started coming to the church and totally took over the youth group. And there's all these Mexican American kids and we didn't know what to do. And so his daughter was in the youth group at the time and she's cute. So he had a vested interest. So he comes up to me at the youth meeting and he goes, so Pastor, I think it's really cool that the neighborhood kids are coming now, but you guys don't know what the hell you're doing. He goes, you cannot be their best friends. They have no structure in their life. I've seen this happen where good-natured churches invite the neighborhood in, and then they start smoking pot in this, and they're necking on the roof, and then you kick them all off the campus. He goes, you need to lay down the law, and I volunteer. Okay? And so he shows up with his Virgin of Guadalupe and his little teardrop, and it's like, all right, this is the rules, right? And just by who he is, they totally got it, right? And then he schooled all of us, and we said, so, man, you have a PhD in street, okay? So he now is a really, really valued member of my staff. But first thing, when he got his first office space, and we, give him the computer like everybody else, I didn't want to assume that he knows how to use Microsoft Office. And so I said, but I also was concerned about his masculinity. I don't want to, so I just kind of went to him on the QT, and I go, dude, I want to do everything in my power to make sure that you feel cool about being here and that you succeed. So if you have any questions about PowerPoint or whatever like that, you don't have to bring it up in the staff meeting. Just come to me, man, because I will give you whatever training you need, because you bring so much on the upside that it's just there's certain tools that we use that you maybe not, you're not used to it. And so we worked all of that, but it takes that kind of deliberate, and even with women, right? It really deliberate, like seeking out. I don't assume that I get you. I know that we need you here, and I don't want you to feel ignored or overlooked or stepped on, and I will still step on it. Okay, so when I do, let me know, and you don't have to nag me. It's like I'll pay attention, and so it's much more conversation. This is kind of the earlier point I wanted to make is one of the ways to find out how to be down with your instrument is to actually play with someone who plays a different instrument. Okay, because I didn't know how Chinese I was till I married a Japanese American. Okay, when you're always just swimming in your own water, you can never see it. So I married this Japanese American. We're both third generation. And then like, why do you do that on New Year's? Right? Or like we go on vacation and we spend the last 2 days at Long's buying presents for everyone else, but they didn't come. Like, why do you think our vacation time doing that? It's omiyage. There's all these people that are covering for us while we're not here, and so we look bad if we come back. And it's like, Chinese don't do that, right. Now, man, so it's just like this interesting thing that all of a sudden your culture is in your face that you never would have to see before. And I think in a multi-ethnic congregation, as that comes up, and it's not just ethnicity, it's we have poor people in the church, and we go, okay, so everyone, it's going to be $10 for the book that we're going to use in the small group, and someone says, I don't have $10. I'm like, wow, right? Or this one guy, he's got cerebral palsy. He joined our sports league, right? He has a crippled hand. Totally changed what happens in the sports league. It's like, okay, you got to put him in, right? And it's just like, I guess winning the championship is no longer the goal, right? The goal is that he really feels a part of the team. And God used him with his disability to actually transform the competitive nature, which is a lot present in Asian church leagues, right? Because they had a higher redemptive value of saying, that person really needs to experience. Same thing when the choir. This guy joined the choir. He can't really sing parts. And he keeps trying out for solos, right? And he's African American. Totally wrecked my stereotypes, right? And so my choir director was from the Berklee Music Institute, and so she had really high standards. And I told her, I said, as high as your music standards are, the higher standard is that we're a faith village, and that he really feels like he can be part of this choir, even if he's not the world's best singer. I'll stand next to him, I'll sing loud, okay? So the next year, she wrote a solo, unbeknownst to him, that she knew that he could qualify for, okay? And he invited his landlord, he invited all the people, he walks around the neighborhood. I got to sing this, so I'd invite anybody, right? He's like, this has never happened before. And did he nail it? No. Okay? But that wasn't the point. And we had visitors come that Sunday, and they go, so what kind of choir is it that guy gets a solo? And I heard the choir member say to them, oh, you don't understand. It's not necessarily about all the notes being right. It's who we're becoming as God's people. And I just celebrate it. So even though it's hard and you have to kind of encounter these things, the payoff, it's indescribably wonderful.
A couple questions in the back. I know that there were, I think maybe we'll go to Naya and then over to Young, and then we'll come back to these tables.
I'll try to formulate my question. It's back to what Reverend Eugene Cho had mentioned about creativity, especially as Asian Americans, with worship and how we conduct our services, and even with the songs themselves. And I think in theory that's a great idea, and I've been wrestling with that myself, being in that position to think about those things. And practically, what does that look like? Because we're in churches that, we are just, so whether we're singing hymns or whether we're singing contemporary songs or whatever, we are sort of borrowing songs and singing them and trying to make them our own. But I'm trying to see what came first, the chicken or the egg kind of question of, like, for instance, African spirituals. They really brought the language for people to understand their faith and their struggle as African Americans, and connecting them with their spirituality. And I think the songs really provided a language as well. And so, but I'm wondering what came first. Was it the language and then the songs that brought them together. And so even with as Asian Americans, we're told and we're encouraged, especially the artists, like write songs that embodies who you are, or create things that are that. But that's like great to think about, but it's a lot harder to do practically. So I was curious, like whether in your churches or you've seen things done out practically, like what does that look like? And how can we as a church, and especially as pastors who value these things, how are we supporting the artists or the songwriters within our community to create these things, create the language of our people into our services and our community?
We do a horrible job at our church, to be honest with you. I think it would be, while somewhat appropriate to share the story of African American spirituals, that our context is very different. And I think it would be awkward or weird to say, we want you to write a song to whoever that person might be that would reflect Asian American spiritualness. For me, I think it's just looking at our context right now and realizing the tools that all of us has to being creative, whatever that would be. Whether it's writing, that we don't always have to go towards the traditional means to have our voices heard. So case in point is New York Times, 4 or 5 months ago, published an article about Asian American artists utilizing YouTube to get their songs out. We can certainly contend about the evils and dangers of using the larger industry as our metric of success. But I think for a lot of artists, we want to make sure that whatever craft that we have, that not only do we produce it, but we also want to make sure that we share it with others as well. I'm not a musician, but I can certainly understand how difficult and laborious that must be, And so this article speaks about how these Asian Americans are utilizing creative means such as technology, YouTube, Facebook, and it's amazing. I don't quite see that kind of persistence and tenacity and energy and creativity taking place in the church. But we have, I think, that social capital as well. I would challenge, I hear a lot of people complain and whine about, man, it's just so hard to break it in publishing and so forth. And I'm sure that it is. One of the reasons why I chose to blog many years ago was because I was so tired of not having voices that in any way resembled my voice. And so I said, screw it. Even if my wife is the only one that reads my blog, and I'll make sure she reads it,
Twice.
I'm going to self-publish.
Right. Yeah.
And in doing so, I was surprised that not only did it resonate with others, but it also empowered other people to start writing as well. So that's what I would say. Here's one thing that our church does that I am very proud about. I would hate for our church to be the bottleneck that determines what comes in and out. Because as Ken was saying, we should all assume we're all Pharisees in need of God's redemptive grace. So I've come to realize I'm just a Pharisee and I'm wanting to love Jesus. And I fear that at our church, as we become 10 years old this fall, much more institutional, that we're kind of the gatekeepers of what comes in and out. So in the beginning of our church, one of the things that we did is that we made a point to take a certain percentage of all the offerings and tithes that came in to start foundations at our church. So we have a church planting foundation, a community development foundation. We also have a global presence foundation, and probably next year we'll start a artist fund as well. These funds can only be used by members of our church. There's $250,000 in these foundations right now. And they are open and available to members of our church, not whatever they want. They have to go through a process like a foundation. But the last thing that we want to do is when people come up and say we have this vision to start this album, this theater thing, this NGO, the last thing that we want to do is say, we'll pray for you. Prayer is nice. We want the church to be deeper equippers. So maybe that's a small connection to what you were saying is I think practically speaking, theoretically speaking, it sounds good on paper. Practically speaking, we need to enable and empower somehow.
And let me say too, Dan Cremona, one of our worship songs was written by Dan Cremona. It's played on the smooth jazz stations now all over the United States because it was too hip for our church, right? When I became a senior pastor, it wasn't it was about our vision. It was called The Doors Open, and we sang it for a couple weeks, and then it was like we can't groove like that, right? So it kind of died in after that, and then the guy who wrote Here and Now, who sings lead for the band, he heard it and he goes, "That's too good of a song to just." So he wrote the rest of the verses. He's a Christian too, and now it was like the #1 hit on the album. So I tell my daughter when it's like, "That's our song. We just don't sing it." Right? But we brought our old worship team over to his home studio one time, and we said, "Make our Vineyard songs." We didn't have Hillsong in those days, right? Make them sound more smooth, right? Like and he goes, "I can't," and it's like, why? It's like because those are based on like country western songs. And you know, jazz is based on the blues. And he says, "Well, I got the solution, write your own songs." Okay, and then everybody on the worship team like, and he goes, "Okay, so here's the problem. It's like you guys never finished the first verse of your first song." And he says, "I write a song every day on average, one song a day, because that's my profession. But I don't write a great song every day." And he says, "You guys are so self-critical. You never finish the first verse of the first song." He says, "After I write 20 songs, then I kind of play them back, and I find out if there was any gems in there. Sometimes there's none, but I need to give them a little breathing space. But when you never finish the first song, you'll never discover if you have a great song in you." And I never forgot that. And I think that speaks loudly to just the Asian American experience. We have this self-critical voice. And it's like, oh, you know, and it's like we need an environment, and even if there's money behind it, we need an environment where people are saying, you don't have to do everything great, but let's do this together, because that's the only way we're going to discover this stuff. I think during the 80s, Asians were really latching on to the Vineyard songs. They were talking about, "God, you're my father," and we're crying and stuff. I think those were popular because Asians had this huge father wound, you know, with their own earthly fathers, and then that got really sappy after a while. Okay, but I do think that again, just like everything else we're saying, Asian American theology, Asian American worship songs, they could be sung by non-Asians if they authentically capture the human experience. It just happens to be from our particular point of view. And so, yeah, I'm encouraging our new worship people to start writing stuff. And it's just like, don't think that no one else is ever going to sing this. If it comes out of this beautiful place, it's gonna have a place in people's worship.
Amen to that. And I want to translate that to our urban immersion program with Azusa Pacific University. I think permission giving is really important. Yeah, that as they are in touch with the poor, homeless, and serving in nonprofit organizations, I've witnessed students who's never written spoken words, they were writing. Students who's never composed a song, they're writing songs. So I think there's a mental block that we don't even have permission, that we can be co-creators rather than imitators. That's number one. Number two is, yes, funding is important. And number three, I think, once again, I'm going back to what Tim presented on the first night. This internalized isms that we are no good, and the image of what Asian Americanness that haunts us subconsciously. So when we do Asian American stuff, it is something, isn't it ghettoizing for Asian American women to write about Asian American women's book? Yes, publishing was really tough. Finding publisher from mainstream took more than 2 years. No matter how much demographic change take place, at the end of the day, those who determine what's going to sell and what's not going to sell, that's the bottom line. So it's money that rules. So I think funding, and I look forward to many Asian American artists and different music than vineyard music being sung. So let's all, Howard Thurman said, poetic justice. I think we need to be poets to be prophetic. So.
Yeah, I know that when I talk to my artists in our community, I think they would question whether there's something such as original creation. And really what we're doing as artists is curating. And I would say, as an artist, if you have an agenda, if there's an end goal when you're creating, in my opinion, it taints the art. And so there's a legendary conversation that I don't know if it actually happened, but supposedly C.S. Lewis and Tolkien on the steps of Oxford had this dialogue and this debate. And this was the debate. I think Tolkien felt like Lewis had an agenda, that his Christ figure was too blatant. And Tolkien thought that you should just be a Christian, just be who you are, and then make art, and your art will reflect it. And I would say for Asian Americans, I don't know if we should write Asian American music. It might be really bad. But let's be Christians. Let's love Jesus. Let's be Asian American. And then if you're an artist, make art and it'll come out.
Could I just qualify that a little bit? I think there's some intentionality that's needed, not agenda. Gospel music could not have been renovated and innovated unless there was an intention to retrieve the sounds of the past.
I'm wondering if we could look also at the aspect of being citizens of heaven and the emphasis also on that aspect versus the cultural fossilization that keeps happening when we step out of our own context or we've inherited one from our parents. I think this will be healthy going forward because, as I've noticed in a lot of the literature, there's less ethnobiographical information coming out, published. There seems to be a gap in the last 7 or 8 years because those issues aren't important anymore about immigrants' experiences, or the new wave of immigrants are much richer. They have economic security or they have economic means, so they can just slot into the wider society and not be in like the traditional ethnic ghettos. So I guess as I say this, I'm wondering if we can move forward and look at our citizenship as being part of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of grace, that maybe like a 3rd, 4th, 5th culture can be cultivated versus where we've kind of come from. I know class and ethnicity is so big in a place of many peoples. I mean, if you look on any profile of any person, say Wikipedia, they tell you, that someone's parent was Swedish or their, mom was English. It's that important somehow in the makeup how we look at people in a census or demographic way, but really, where are we going and who are we? What is the common humanity? And I think that's going to be helpful versus the umbrella aspect. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, because one day we're going to just say we're so far removed from Asia, or we're so mixed in our backgrounds, or I'm Canadian, apparently. This is a very interesting setting for me to be in, even though it's only 2.5 hour drive down. This is a different culture. But I see a stronger bond underneath because we're called to be God's people. Thank you.
Go Canucks.
Jesus was cultural Jesus too. I think your question, I'll just say one word. Jesus incarnated to human culture, and Jesus also had gender.
Wow, silence, really.
I think creation is important. God is the creator of all of us. Our ethnicity, our earthly identities are important. Otherwise, Scripture would not spend so much time talking about Moses' background or Daniel's background. So even as you asked that question about having a heavenly agenda, which I think all of us agree with, let's not contrast it so much with ethnic as if that's fossilized and that's dead. I don't believe that's part of us that God wants us to get rid of, but that's the part that God wants us to redeem. So when we go to the kingdom of heaven at the banquet, I think all of our rich diversity of identities will be present.
Yeah, I think it's always going to be a hybrid, and that's incarnation. So I remember when I was at Fuller, same time Wayne was there, I was walking with my professors, and he says, "So Ken, what church are you going to serve when you graduate?" I said, "Oh, I'm going to be in an Asian American church." He goes, "Oh, you're going to be underpaid, and you're going to waste your potential." Nice counsel from my professor. So I said, "Well, it's a hard thing for me to look around this campus, and at the time the Koreans weren't there the way they are now, right?" I said, "There's hardly anybody that looks like me and Wayne." And so there's all these people that don't know Jesus that just because of how God made us, that they'll open the door, so to speak, much more readily than to expect all these white people to, some of them feel called to go do that. Okay, so I just said, I feel like if I ignore my face, if I ignore my culture, in some ways it's not stewarding all that God has given me. Okay? Now, and that's pretty much stayed the same all this time, even though I find that, again, being down with my face, I'm able to jam with other faces, right? So that works on so many levels. So that's one thing. I feel like to deny the flesh part is to not know how to really leverage that or steward that, okay? On the other hand, I also teach that science now, anthropology, is saying there's only been one human race on the earth, and we're all from Africa, okay? So everything else that we're looking at is really more custom and culture, and it's literally only skin deep, some of these physical things. And so I'm preaching that too, and I'm saying, hey folks, there's a common humanity. It's also like all the different kinds of dogs, but we're all dogs, right? And it's like, so a lot of this other stuff about this one's better than that one, or even racial reconciliation, I said this language is divisive, it's not accurate, okay? This is not a multiracial child. It's human and what else, right? So it's like, we've got a lot of work to do because it's so prevalent, but at the same time, it's also what the Bible's always been saying. So I said, it's both understanding the flesh and the context, and at the same time, understanding it's the same flesh.
If I could get the last word on this, which I'll take my privilege as moderator, I think one of the dangers of embracing sort of a post-racial moment too heartily is abandoning ethnicity really reduces our understanding of racialization. And I think we really need double movement. I think we need to watch for these cues of how race and notions of race are changing, and yet to never leave behind or overlook the significant ways that it has marked our stories and will continue to for the unforeseeable future. So I think, and there's also conversations, I think Canadian, American, cross-border conversations that we need to have about sort of the ways that national identity has been forged here in a way that it hasn't taken place in Canada. And so I think there's good ways that our Canadian brothers and sisters can help us to think through patriotism and nationalism and idolatry in those ways as well. And so I think you guys have a lot to offer us as well. At this point, we are done. I apologize for those but our panelists, I want to thank our panelists. So, Billy has a couple of announcements, and then we'll close out with benediction.
Right. Oh, wow. Okay. This has been a fabulous conference. I'm so really grateful that, again, there's such a wonderful turnout, I think, from our churches here in the Pacific Northwest. And again, from many pioneers and leaders through which I believe that we are at a moment where we're building upon essentially the years and the decades that you've labored for. And so thank you so much for joining us for our inaugural conference as we launch the Asian American Ministry Program. I do want to make a couple of announcements for those of you who had stayed here in Emerson. Checkout is actually taking place at 12:30 to 1:30 in Emerson. If you need to leave very quickly, you can drop off your envelope with your keys in it to the folks that are attending the registration desks in the front. Also, we have a Facebook page that's called, or at least the URL is facebook.com/AAMP Seattle Pacific. If you haven't taken a look at our Facebook page, I just want to encourage you to like our page and follow us from there. We're also going to be launching our website here this summer. So I encourage you to continue to look for it. It'll be at spu.edu/AAMP. And lastly, in terms of just an announcement, before I kind of move to my thank yous, some of you may have had a chance to pick up one of our case statements or some of our literature. I want to encourage you, if you would like to pick up a copy for someone or like to take one home, we have all of this literature out front at our registration desks as well. The Asian American Ministry Program it only exists because of a grant that we received from the Murdoch Foundation. And it will continue to only be sustained by the gifts and the wisdom of God's people. We really appreciate your prayers as we continue to move forward from here and launching the program. Specifically, the cost of this event here was completely provided by a few different folks. So I want to thank, first off, Lighthouse Christian Church for a generous gift that they gave to us and the support that they've continued to show to us specifically for this conference. I want to thank the folks also of Catalyst Leadership Center, Peter Cha. I know that you guys are on your own shoestring budget, but we thank you for a gracious gift that you provided for us as well. And lastly, the large majority of the funding for this conference was provided by the Center for Biblical and Theological Education that's housed here in the School of Theology here at Seattle Pacific. And I need something from you. Each of you has a survey on your desk, or sorry, your desk table, and and some pens. If we at all want to, if we have any hope of any sort of funding in the future for an event similar to this, we need you to fill this out so that we can provide our feedback on just how this event went, and we can report that back to the sources of our funding. Lastly, or actually a couple more things. This event, the vision for this event, the vision of it being past, present, and future, the vision for our speakers and our seminars was really formed because of a few folks. Our faculty advisory team, Dr. Bo Lim, Dr. David Leong, Mary Maidney, Brian Bantam, Nijay Gupta, and even Doug. You've all played a role in helping to formulate this vision. I want to thank you for that. I especially want to thank two pastors that were very instrumental in advising me and ensuring that the agenda really connected, I think, with our churches and the concerns of our churches. So I want to thank Pastor J.P. Kong, as well as Pastor Nancy Sugikawa and Pastor Wayne for just the invaluable ways in which I've cherished your counsel, your support, your wisdom along the way. I would be remiss to not thank the volunteers and the administrative staff that have really made this event possible. So I'd like to thank Raul Perez, who is the manager, the office manager of Seattle Pacific Seminary and the School of Theology, Kelsey Job, who's one of our graduate students in the seminary, Sam Song, who is also a seminary student, and a friend of mine, Young Lin, who's also helped out and jumped into the mix to support in invaluable ways. So thank you so much for the ways in which you guys have been flexible and supported us. And thank you again for attending. Thank you again for making this meaningful. Thank you to those who have spoken into this conversation. we realize that there are many questions that are still unanswered. But I think the point of it is that we're gathering and we're talking, we're sharing, and we're beginning to try and envision what hopefully the contribution of us as Asian American Christians, the contribution of our churches, and ultimately the contribution of this Asian American ministry program can provide to the gospel in the North American church in the 21st century. So thank you so much for being here. At this point, I'd like to invite our Dean of Seattle Pacific Seminary to come up and close us in a benediction.
It's been a rich and wonderful time together. Thank you, all of you, for your attendance, for your participation, for your active involvement, for all the speakers and the panelists. Wow, my mind is kind of overwhelmed right now. I don't know about yours, by all the new ideas and thoughts, and so I'm very thankful for that. I want you to, all of you, to be on the lookout for what's going to be happening here. It's going to be an exciting time to see how new programming's going to be developing, more conferences in the future, and opportunities for you to have resources. I like the idea, by the way, of having some kind of an online resource. There are just so many possibilities. And while we are, of course, serving the Pacific Northwest in particular, I see this center as becoming something that's going to be a national focus, and maybe for our Canadian friends, international as well, in the future. So thank you all for that. Please pray for us and for this ministry. And we encourage you to tell others about it as well. And also, if you know of folks who may be interested in being potential students as well. There's been so much great talk about Paul's theology of reconciliation in the New Humanity, hasn't there? It's been very, to me, we're pushing new understandings, or maybe very, very old, as in apostolic understandings that we're recovering. And to me, that's been really thought-provoking. And so I thought we would end this time together by hearing the words of Paul from Ephesians. And so if you'd stand with me, let's hear the words of our brother who speaks to us over the many centuries and really helps us to understand God's word to us today. And this is taken from Ephesians chapter 4. I beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all. And now as we think about our speaking and working with each other and speaking the truth in love, we must grow up in every way into Him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by every ligament with which it is equipped, as each part is working properly, promotes the body's growth in building itself up in love. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, may you go in peace. Amen.